Hey Daniel, thanks so much for making time to be with me today. How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, it's my pleasure. I appreciate you reaching out, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about Aircrete. So, what do you say we just jump right in?
Oh, absolutely.
If you could give us a little about your personal background and what interested you
Oh,
in construction to begin with, and what got you interested in Aircrete eventually.
okay. Well, I kind of grew up around construction most of my life, and in one form or another, I've been involved in construction for over 30 years. And aircrete is something that just kind of surfaced as an alternative building method when I was, I've built everything. I've rammed earth, I've packed cob, I've done wattle and daub, and for a situation coming up in my life, it just happens to be that this was a super convenient answer that one person can take out into the middle of absolutely nowhere and slap together.
Okay, so like we were doing before, let's start by talking about what it is and how it differs from what people already know about concrete itself.
Right. Aircrete is not cement. Aircrete is just Portland. Technically, cement is the combination of Portland cement and sand and gravel. But the difference with aircrete is that we entrain air into the actual Portland cement. We inflate it 6 times its normal volume, and this creates an insulating structural product. So it's both structure and insulation. It's not as strong as cement, but it's compressively, it's just as strong as a 2x4 wall or any thickness of wall on 24-inch centers. So that's pretty
So
much
it's like a rigid foam held together with the same cement that would make up concrete, but without the heavy added material of sand and gravel.
exactly, and a lot of air, which makes it light.
Sure. All right, so walk me through the process. What kind of equipment do you need, and how long does it take to make a mix like this? What are the different ingredients?
All right. Well, the primary ingredient, of course, is just a bag of Portland cement and water. Typically, you'll add about 5 gallons of water to an entire bag of Portland cement, and then you'll do this. I like to have a barrel with a pivot on it so I can eliminate any lifting when at all possible. And you just use an 8 amp or stronger drill and a good three blade flat spiral mixer, and you turn your foam on. And the foam is it can be at soap bubbles, but honestly some kind of foaming agent like Drexel foam is a lot stronger, works better. And so you have another 5 gallons of water that is a dilution of your foaming agent and water, and you turn on a pump and you pump this into the bottom of your mixing container, and you run your drill until it has inflated itself to a mark on your mixing container that equals about 6 cubic feet.
Wow.
So,
Okay. And this is all contained in what size of a bucket that you're doing this?
well, for a single 92-pound bag of Portland cement, we use a 50-gallon drum and a 30-inch mixing blade, which works out to just about 6 cubic feet by the time the cement gets into the drill.
Gotcha. And what kind of chemicals are the foaming agents made up of? Are there different options, or like the one you mentioned that was ideal? Is that really what you recommend?
Yeah, I really recommend the Drexel foam. People like the idea of using something like seventh generation, and certainly I could support the idea of supporting a company that's trying to do the right thing. But Drexel is actually, it's made out of proteins from animals apparently. But
Okay.
and it's a byproduct of the existing slaughter industry, which is not a beautiful topic, but it's non-toxic, in other words.
Gotcha. So you've got non-vegan walls, but it's not a toxic product either.
Exactly.
All right, so give me an idea of what the construction process looks like. Once you've mixed your foam up in this 55-gallon barrel, and you said you've got it on a pivot to avoid having to lift anything, where are you pouring this in? How are you forming it into a wall structure?
Well, if you're building something like a dome or you want blocks to stack, then you'll have a block form, a mold sitting right there beside you, and you'll just simply pour it into this mold. And when you're done mixing and pouring, you insert metal or even plastic dividers, and you wait 24 hours. And at the end of that 24 hours, you pull your blocks out of your mold. And right then, even though they're still somewhat brittle, you can pick them up and begin construction with them right then. And that is the more laborious method, because then you have to mortar these blocks back together. And that's not with regular mortar, that would be with an Aircrete mortar. And then there's the option to build a cast structure, and it can be rectangular, it can be circular, it can be almost any shape, as long as you can create a mold to contain your Aircrete in until it sets. And that casting method is my preferred method, because it's just so fast and it takes out so much of the time and the labor.
Let's face it, having an alternative building constructed for you can cost more than conventional construction, up to $250 per square feet. Building a 450 square foot house can cost as much as $90,000 to have a company build. Build it yourself and save $80,000. Do you want to build alternative homes for others as a professional? You could profit up to $70,000. The material of the building is immaterial. Slapping mud on a wall, ramming earth, stuffing a bag with dirt, or Aircrete. These skills can be learned in a day or two. The real skill begins when you are ready to make your tiny house functional. Electric, solar, air conditioning, plumbing, flooring, or alternative waste water management. This is where many people fail to finish their homes or pay large sums of money to hire skilled labor. Others fail in the planning or logistic stages. They buy the wrong land, underestimate cost, do not know how to hire and manage unskilled labor, or fail to connect infrastructure. This is why we now offer the Terlingua Alternative Building School. Beginner or experienced builder, come learn how to build a tiny house from scratch in far less time and expense than traditional paths of learning. You can learn and experience every skill you need. Now you can proceed with confidence to build the house and life of your dreams.
Okay, so I guess it depends on the design and the form of your building, which one might have advantages. Because, I've heard you mention that this is a really good material to take out into the middle of nowhere and be able to construct with a minimal amount of materials. But if you have to put together some complicated formwork, that's going to up the labor and the difficulty of the build.
Oh, absolutely. Obviously, blocks are the most simplistic way that you can build, and there's huge industries around using blocks, and a lot of your common hired labor, of course, already knows how to work with blocks. So it lends itself to simplicity.
Sure. Now, you mentioned too that there's an Aircrete mortar that needs to be used when assembling the blocks. Is that a different mixture, or are you really just taking what you would normally put into the forms and using that as your mortar?
Yeah, for the mortar, it's basically the same thing, except you're adding a product which is typically latex or acrylic bonding agent. And the reason you put this in the mix is you want it to really stick to the blocks. It's a more thin mix than standard mortar, and you don't want something that's not going to fully bond your block to create a weak spot in your construction later.
Sure. Are there any risks of maybe the entrance of impurities either in your foaming agent or during the process that could compromise the foaming ability of the material and cause it to deflate before it cures?
Well, generally, the most common thing is if it's deflating, there's been too much water added to the mix, and you just simply have to reduce the amount of water. Um, Generally, your foam is going to work unless, of course, you don't have enough of your foaming agent. For example, if you're using a 5-gallon bucket for your foaming agent, you have to put an entire 16-ounce bottle of soap into that. And so if you run short on soap, then the bubbles will pop. And the idea behind the bubble is not to really hold the structure except as long as necessary to entrain it into the cement. It's actually the thickness or viscosity of the cement that holds the bubble in place. So the bubble is just there long enough to get the bubble mixed into the cement.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned that the bricks or the formwork would be workable within 24 hours, but cement takes a longer period of time to cure. So how long would you recommend before putting any kind of load or stress on those blocks or those or the casts or the molds, I suppose, before it can really take the amount of pressure that it was designed to?
Well, it reaches full design strength in about 28, 30 days. And of course, that depends upon temperature, obviously. Um, you can accelerate that by adding hot water to the mix. But generally, you know, in 24 hours, you can pick up the blocks, you can move them, you can go ahead and build a building with them. But obviously, you have to avoid striking them or dropping them or anything that could put a microfracture or a crack that's going to show up as a break after the block matures.
Hmm. And once it's fully cured, do you have an idea of how much PSI it can withstand?
Yeah, with the equipment that I have, my scale tops out, but I'm consistently getting over 168 pounds per square inch.
Okay. That's a good
So,
reference point to get an idea of how much of a like roof heft you can put on it.
well,
Um, yeah, go
right.
ahead.
If you think about snow load and you know how much weight that is, and then you look at how much cement, for example, a 450 square foot single bedroom, small or tiny house, um, the whole thing soaking wet, if that were even possible to get it immediately out of the barrel and stack it up, is somewhere around 53,000 pounds. And when you actually divide that out over the thickness of a wall that's 6 or 8 inches thick, it actually winds up being under 11 pounds per square inch. So there's actually this tremendous safety margin between what it's capable of withstanding versus what is actually put on the structure.
Hmm. Okay. And now I know, especially in the case of the domes, you recommend then giving a stucco layer on the entire outer portion of one of these like bubble forms. And I think a lot of people who are familiar with Aircrete in any way have usually seen these types of images. I feel like this is how it's gotten, it's become best known. I know I first learned about it when I saw some of those forms at a construction site in Thailand, I believe it was. And so covering it then with stucco, this is not still the same Aircrete mixture. This is a proper concrete stucco,
Yeah,
correct?
correct. First of all, it's Aircrete has a great amount of compressive strength, relatively speaking, but it has very little tensile strength. So, you know, if you put it on two blocks, for example, and apply pressure in the middle, it's going to pull apart. And the way you strengthen that is with a reinforcing fabric. And this fabric is applied to the exterior with a regular cement mixture that's fairly high in acrylic or latex, and that is used to bond the outside. So it's like a more conventional stucco mix. You apply it to the exterior, you lay on your fabric, and then you work this through the fabric, and then you apply a finish coat to the top of the fabric. And
Okay.
acrylic stuccos are great if you want to put a second final finish on there. You can just paint it, but obviously because it's a porous cement structure, it can absorb water, and it is important to seal it from the elements.
Have you experimented with other types of sealants other than cement stucco? Because it seems to me that while the ease and the transportability of the equipment and the materials to make something like this potentially in a remote region would be somewhat undercut by the amount of sand or gravel. I guess gravel not so much for the stucco, but sand that you would have to either import or excavate on site in order to do that final layer.
Yeah, we've actually in Mexico we started using just it's a what's the word, elastomer type brick and stucco paint. So it's literally just a can of paint that can be applied to seal it, and it works very successfully. And it's just maybe, you know, would require a little more maintenance in the long run. You know, you'd need to repaint your structure every few years, whereas something like an acrylic stucco is going to really maintain that seal for a longer period of time.
Sure. Yeah, I know that the few problems that I've had and I've seen when I worked in the industrial construction trades was more that, you know, given the brittleness of a cement stucco, it can have, even if you're not able to see it very easily, sort of micro cracks in it that allow moisture through. And I would imagine in the case of putting on a dome like that, that could be a risk that could compromise the structure. Have you come up against any issues like that?
Well, I haven't so far, because when you put that finish coat and that fabric on there, it's generally waterproof and it's not going to crack through that fabric. And the layer underneath the fabric is generally water resistant. I'm not going to say waterproof, but I've never seen an instance where water was able to soak into a wall.
Gotcha. Now, you've worked with a whole bunch of different types of designs. I've seen on your website, especially the domes, those sort of bubble forms that we talked about. But you said you also really like to work with formwork. What are some of your favorite designs, or that you especially advocate for people who are getting started with this material?
Well, you can do rectangular forms, but I just happen to really love the circular form. And so that cylinder shape is the one I prefer, because you can buy that cheap utility grade plywood. You can slap it together, and the very nature of the shape itself, it's almost like when you roll up a sheet of paper, it becomes strong enough that you could put a cup of coffee on top of a sheet of paper. The shape itself holds the form in place, and with very little effort, you can put up a form that doesn't cost a lot. And one person could bucket this in. For example, if you were building a small 16-foot cabin, you can actually make it livable in 14 days, because it only takes 6, 7 days to get the wall up. And that's if you're by yourself and if you stick to it and get the work done.
Yeah, I mean, those types of statistics are really promising for people who are working with limited resources or don't necessarily have help available to get a project like this done. Oftentimes, just getting moved into a spot, even if it doesn't happen to be your final finished building on the land, can make the difference between continuing to pay rent somewhere else and having the ability to save extra money and put on the time on the site that you need to build something more substantial in the longer run. Yeah.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Because sometimes if you can get out of paying rent, for example, if you're just starting, that's the quickest way to really move forward on the project. And, sometimes I come up against this all or nothing thinking that people have. And, it's like, well, I've got to have my mansion and every detail right now. But if you take more of the attitude that the original settlers of this country had, then you start with what's necessary. And maybe that little initial structure that gets you on the land immediately, maybe that becomes your closet or your bathroom later. Or maybe it's not even attached to the house, maybe it's a storage building. So yeah, it absolutely lends itself to a quick project that can put you in something. And it's not like a tent or a yurt that really does leave you uncomfortable. These structures are very comfortable.
My favorite part about taking on sort of a smaller project like that is that a lot of the people who are attempting this for the first time either don't have a lot of construction experience, or I guess even in the other case of not being having any familiarity with living in kind of compromised situations like that, where they don't have the luxuries that they're used to, or the plumbing and the conveniences. And certainly in my experience, even just living in tents, sometimes you realize how little you actually need to be healthy and to be happy, and the few things that you really miss you will make a priority when you make another building or design another structure for the longer term.
Oh, absolutely. It's in my opinion a great thing to experience, because like you said, you begin to realize what you can do without, and then what you really need. And sometimes that's you distill it down to the essence of what it is that you need. And you can make mistakes on a small project, and it's not a deal breaker. It's no problem.
For sure. And you mentioned that this has insulative properties, and that's often one of the things that especially natural builders come up against, that there are few options for insulating a building if you go purely natural structures. Do you have the stats on the R value per inch of Aircrete?
Well, I don't have an exact R value. You can do it calculating, but what I do is actually measure. I just put a video out on YouTube on how to do this, and you can actually raise or lower the temperature of a structure and measure it. And what I'm finding is that it's consistently slightly less than a standard fiberglass insulation. And per square foot, it takes an additional 6.25% of insulation to achieve the same value. So the walls need to be a little thicker. If you're depending upon a certain R value, like 2x4s R11 or R13 for a 2x6 wall, then maybe instead of doing a 6-inch wall, you push it out 7 to 8 inches to have an equivalent amount of insulation.
Gotcha.
But,
And let's talk a little bit more about the compromises that we're dealing with using cement as a building material. I mean, you and I went back and forth by email for a little while, and I was tentative to promote the idea of Aircrete on this podcast because in the past I've really focused just on natural materials. But I know you've got experience working with other natural materials in contrast. So how does this stack up, in your opinion, to natural or more locally produced or less processed materials, as far as sort of ease of use in construction and impact on the environment through the process and the manufacturing?
Okay. First of all, it depends upon your environment. Whatever you do, whatever you build, it really needs to be appropriate for where you're at. If you're in the tropics, you don't necessarily need walls, but if you're in the Northeast, you have driving rains and cold, you need walls. And in a similar manner, whenever you're choosing alternative building, in the majority of the climates, if we're designing to be a passive system, you really need insulation and thermal mass. And Aircrete, of course, is structural and it provides insulation as well. And with insulation, you can provide an active source of cooling, or you can design it to be more passive through using windows to absorb the heat. But it's not, it is different. It does produce a great deal more pollution. Natural materials are very nice and forgiving, but on the flip side of that is the amount of labor and time it can take you, because typically a lot of natural building requires excavation of quite a lot of material. And if you're doing that by shovel, it's absolutely backbreaking, miserable work. Or you have to rent a large excavator or something to do the work for you, or you need a great deal of hands present whenever you do your project to get it done. So again, like I said in the beginning, Aircrete is kind of a convenience thing in terms of speed. If you're paying someone to build alternatively, it often costs a substantial amount more than conventional construction even.
That is true.
So, you have to look at your situation, decide what's appropriate for you. Now, as far as Aircrete and what it does to the environment, it's obviously not as environmentally friendly. It's made from limestone. This limestone has to be heated. When you heat limestone, you drive off carbon dioxide, not to mention the energy used in the manufacture and transport of this limestone that becomes our cement. But basically, for every 2,205 pounds of Portland cement that's produced, there's 2,044 pounds of carbon dioxide that goes into the air in that production process. If you're just looking strictly at a CO2 perspective. And so to help get an idea of what that means, if you were to build that 1-bedroom, 450 square foot dome, you would need about 26,200 pounds of cement. And that would off-gas into the environment about 24,286 pounds of CO2. And
yeah, it's not insignificant. Now, to me, the compromise with that always is like, yeah, building with industrial materials can go a lot faster, but it's because a lot of the processing and a lot of the manufacturing has been pre-done for you to make it easy at the point of construction. Right. Whereas because of all of that processing not being the case, if you're excavating your materials by hand, if you're felling and shaping wood on your own, you're doing the processing there on site. And because chances are you're using less machinery to do it, the efficiency goes down, but you tend to be paying the money to a person rather than to a corporation in an industrial process. And I'm not saying that there aren't, mitigating reasons for both sides, but those were always kind of how I did the calculations for myself and explained it to clients. Now, I guess the pitfall for me when it comes to industrial materials, especially ones that are lower in price, that doesn't reflect the entire process and are easier to assemble, is just a matter of like, which industry are you paying, right? Are you paying the industry that, does all of these things through mechanical processes, large mining, everything that you just mentioned with the CO2 embedded in it and the transport there. And in facilitating the ease for the user or the constructor, the person constructing the building, the risk for me is then that people are going to start slapping up Aircrete buildings or concrete structures or, whatever plastic or petroleum-based composite comes out next, not thinking through the entire lifespan of the building. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the lifespan of this product weathering over time? Can it be does it last as long as cement the way that we think of traditionally, or does it kind of degrade and spall because it doesn't have the same structural integrity over time?
I've never observed any degrading of the material. It's my belief that it can be a multi-generational house. And a lot of it, and this would of course apply to any structure, but if you were to take your gray water and plant just 13 trees beside your structure, you would in 40 years zero the carbon footprint of the structure. And
Assuming a very small size of the structure, or what kind of structure are we talking about?
well, as an example, a little one small bedroom, 450 square foot dome.
Gotcha.
And of course,
Just for reference.
right, you obviously would want to plant more trees if you're building a bigger structure. And of course, therein lies part of the American attitude. We want to have a 2,500 square foot house for a single person who's always at work and never home.
Yeah.
So you can, I believe you can be responsible with it. And yes, it's a big deal to go out and strip mine a mountain range or something for limestone as opposed to excavating local materials. And it's definitely nice to actually put the money in the hands of a person instead of a soulless corporation. But, as far as offsetting the carbon footprint, you can do that. The shade from the trees, electricity usage, actually the cost of ownership of a home is often living in the home more than the home itself. And it even holds true for the CO2. For each kilowatt of electricity you produce, there's something like 1.4 pounds of CO2 release. So over that same 40-year period, if you're using electricity like the average American, that's nearly 600,000 pounds of CO2 because you're using electricity from the grid. Or if you're driving to work, over that same period of time, for what average American over that 40 years, you'd produce 2 million pounds of carbon dioxide driving. So
yeah, and ultimately that's why I was really looking forward to this conversation, because though I'm not entirely convinced that Aircrete is sort of the solution compared to natural buildings, it does offer a much more positive alternative to conventional, I guess, industrial and highly destructive construction, and is perhaps a stepping stone towards a better way of building. But also because I have read some of your articles and heard some of your talks, not only on other podcasts, but in your videos, and I can tell that you've thought through more of the process of, regardless of the material itself, kind of how we live and design with our homes is the bigger issue. Because, having worked with natural materials in the past, you can design a consumptive building with natural materials. You can still live a consumptive lifestyle, a wasteful lifestyle, even if you kind of, invest in sustainable or regenerative technologies and green this and that. It has much more to do with the decisions that you make on a daily basis and how or where you're sourcing your resources that you depend on at a regular time. And from the designs and especially the integration of things like appropriate technology, which you've mentioned in other articles, you can kind of offset this smaller building cost through the decisions and the infrastructure that you put in and around it. So can you talk about some of the other features that you would advocate for integrating in with an Aircrete building?
Absolutely. Talking about the amount of CO2 and energy used, honestly, there's all this great alternative stuff out there. You probably have heard of cool tubes, where you bury pipes in the ground and they create cooling for your house.
Sure.
And so, it sounds like such a great idea, but then you actually put the energy cost into it to make that effective, to move enough air through a system like that. You wind up using enough energy that it's the equivalent to using something like a ground sourced heat pump. With one, you're at the mercy of what the environment gives you. And if you live in an environment where it's consistently hot, you may not be cool enough, certainly by the end of the summer. And then you've got the issue of a system that grows mold that you can't clean. And, society, as you're talking about it, we've got all this prepackaged stuff, and it's the very lifestyles that we live and the value that we place on things that I think may be the core issue. For example, I could go out on my property and just using the small trees and sticks and limbs, I could build a double-walled wattle and daub house. Maybe I put a liner in the bottom for waterproofing, and then I fill it with straw to give me an R32 insulating house that's built 99% free from local on-site materials. But the way society is structured, it's so much more, quote, valuable to use my time to just go buy a truckload of clay and a truckload of sand and some timber and a saw, cut it up, and then assemble an artificial structure out of natural materials. And
Sure.
Yeah, so, there's always that struggle with there. Because like you said, you can make an alternative building. It can be as industrial and more costly and more harmful even than buying something from a larger source. So, it's kind of like that permaculture saying, it depends, right? You have
Oh,
to.
it always depends. Yeah. And if someone has a bottled answer for you, you can almost bet yourself that it's going to be wrong, because if you're not taking in considerations of the context, the place, the lifestyle, all of those factors, it's not really going to be a solution that works for those things. And I do appreciate that aspect, that perspective that you bring to this. And I certainly don't consider myself to be such a purist. I mean, even as a natural builder myself, I've worked in industrial building trades, and I don't know of anybody who's built an entirely natural building. I mean, you're still using screws and nails at the very least. And if you want electricity and plumbing, good luck trying to find natural materials that'll achieve those types of things for you. I mean, we just live a lifestyle and in a world that requires a certain amount of industrial inputs in order to interact with it the way that it was designed. And so a certain amount of compromise and hybridizing of traditional skills, natural materials, and the context of the modern world has to happen. And I think that this is a very important conversation to have when you get to the point of designing for context and place. And before I forget it, though, because we are kind of going deeper into the philosophy of the building and the living environments that we create for ourselves, you talked a bit about how you really like the rounded and the domed design. And certainly this isn't unique just to Aircrete, but I've seen it a lot in like earth bag construction, or sometimes called super adobe, and it can be achieved with a number of different types of materials. The one thing that I've personally always found, and I've had a lot of clients come to me like, because people get really enamored with this kind of curvy, organic or circular shape in the design of their homes, but it can be really hard to furnish, to add the types of things that we're used to, everything from tables and chairs to washing machines, they're all built for rectilinear design. How have you kind of overcome that or worked it out within your own buildings, or do you just simply make everything custom?
Well, things like cabinets against the wall, they're going to have to be custom, but we have to deal with the mindset too. We've often grown up in sticks box houses. Our furniture's square, so we shove it to the walls and we walk through the middle of the room. But if you actually stop and think about it a little differently, and instead of trying to do the same thing with a different shape, instead of shoving the square peg in the round hole, you can put your furniture in the middle facing outwards and let the outer rounded edges be the walkways and the pathways. So it just requires a little different layout and thought process. And it's actually pretty amazing how roomy the structure can feel and how you can kind of avoid a lot of those issues by just simply not packing everything around the edge, because it's not a box and it is curved. So, obviously things like appliances and stoves, and they're just going to come off the shelf the way they are, unless you're going to build a rocket cob indoor stove and heater, then you do have to make
You
some
definitely
compromises.
should. Those things are super cool. But anyway, yeah. No, but I agree with all of that except for one part. When it comes to domes, I'm not crazy tall, but I'm 6 foot, and if I'm walking around the edge of a dome and it starts to curve in, I've often found that really uncomfortable. And though I'm totally on board with I love a curvilinear or sort of more organic form for interior shapes. I really agree that it can feel a lot more roomy and certainly a lot more comforting than boxy and hard shapes and sharp lines and such. But certainly, I would recommend for people who are a little bit taller to consider how you're going to move around in that space, because if you've got a hunch or kind of bend as you're going around, it's fun for a novelty, but if you're going to be doing that every day, because I've definitely lived in those structures, it's a point that you want to consider in the design.
Oh, absolutely. Obviously with cylinders, it's not an issue. Now with domes, typically because it looks artistic and kind of nice, we actually raise the entire structure above the equator. And
Yeah.
I advocate using 3D software. And since if it's going to be your house, you decide how close you need to be to the wall. I say about a foot for my height. I want to be able to pretty much, or maybe 6 inches. I want to be able to walk up to the wall without hitting my head on the wall. So we'll either raise the entire structure and let it tuck under more like a sphere, or we'll actually put it on a stem wall. But absolutely, you do need to be aware of that issue, because nobody wants to walk around having to lean their head to one side or bend over. That would never be comfortable.
I've just smacked my head on too many things to not mention that when talking about the design process.
Yeah.
So look, to get back into sort of the theory and the concept of the design and the way that we live and such, I just finished actually having a conversation with April McGill, who's been on this podcast before and is going to be on an episode soon, maybe even before this one. And we kind of had come through a roundabout way to the conclusion that if you want to live as healthy as possible, you want to live as close to the outdoors as possible. And certainly that is easier in certain climates than it is in others. Like you mentioned, in tropical areas where you barely need walls, maybe just sort of like insect guards and nets in a lot of cases if your roof overhangs are tall enough. What kind of environment does this Aircrete sort of allow for? I know that the insulation allows you then to live comfortably in a range of climates where the temperature swings are more extreme without having to import too much energy to do that in. But what are some of the design techniques within that you would advocate for to allow for ventilation and make sure that you're still letting nature into the space?
Yeah, I really like, first of all, good light. And I'm a big fan of these polished aluminum tubes. They don't let a lot of heat in, but man, they really bring a lot of light in. And air quality is very important. These domes, it's not like normal houses and fiberglass. Air does not blow through these walls. And so it's a very tight structure, and it's absolutely necessary that you ventilate them properly. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with sweating walls and humid environment and just generally unhealthy. So what I really prefer in this example is to install if you're in the south, you can install an energy recovery ventilator. If you're in the north, you need a heat recovery ventilator. But it's basically a box with an air heat exchanger and a fan. It doesn't pull much power at all, but it allows you to exchange the volume of the entire structure, at least 6 times a day. That way the air stays fresh, but it has the advantage of balancing the incoming and outgoing air temperature so that you're not just wasting energy. And, if it's 100 outside, you don't want it to be 100 inside. So you want to balance that air out without having to run your air conditioner more. And it's a good modern way to do that. If I wasn't going to do that, then yeah, I would probably put in a skylight that can be opened and some lower windows in the direction of the prevailing breeze. And of course, that depends on your lifestyle. Again, if you want to live open, I really do like living outdoors, and I totally agree with the idea. In fact, I love the idea of having an outdoor kitchen, and when possible, doing the living outside, and then just retreating to a smaller living space when the weather is just not hospitable.
Sure. Yeah, I've described this in the past to clients and in some of my design workshops of like a gradient that you want to achieve, where only the most essential functions like sleeping, in some cases eating and washing, are fully enclosed inside of a building. Now, obviously, this is going to change in the climate or in the area that you're living in and how many months out of the year it's comfortable for you to actually shift a lot of your functions into the outdoors. But then once the essentials are kind of taken up and you know enough storage space to store your essentials as well, try and move as many of your daily tasks into various states of outdoors. So maybe one would be like 2 or 3 walls encompassing an outdoor kitchen or a living room space. And from there on, perhaps a semi-translucent roof and maybe one or no walls, just a stick frame around it, all the way out into a point where it's like stippled shade and water can still get through, depending on the appropriateness of that design for your site. Have you worked with any designs like that, integrating Aircrete or other natural materials into the finished product?
Well, a lot of what I do right now is private workshops. We'll go out and teach people and they'll build their own houses. And with Aircrete, I haven't had any real opportunity to do much more than create a nice trellised area with a lot of plants growing on it and a water feature. That way you have a nice, cool living space. And, that way your living area is generally outside most of the time. In other alternative structures, I've worked with earthships, and so obviously, you've got the interior wall, you've got the greenhouse area, you've got an exterior wall. Um, those work great in so many climates. In New Mexico, where they build them, of course, it may be 113 during the day, but then it's also 53 at night, so it works perfect. In my climate, we've built one structure where we have an outdoor kitchen. It was a more conventional rammed earth house with foam insulation on it, but we have a nice big outdoor kitchen that's designed. The shrubbery goes out in a V or opens up into the prevailing breeze, so it literally focuses the wind down on the area where you're going to be standing. It creates a natural breezeway that's very comfortable. And then we have vines on the top, and they do most of their cooking out there, except whenever the weather's not good. So, yeah, I've had the opportunity to do that on a couple of occasions, just one with Aircrete.
Nice. Well, it seems to me like this is kind of an infinitely moldable tool, easy to work with, especially for people without technical experience and a lot of skills. And, though I have some hangups about the material itself, I am very curious to see how this develops because it's only been a few years since I even really saw this come out on the scene. And it's really exploded in popularity, even to the point where a couple of my natural builder friends are getting involved with Aircrete builds and advocating for it through their clients too, just because of the ease and the quickness of the builds. I really appreciate you coming and sharing some of your perspective and experience on this, as well as some good hard information. I know you have a whole lot more that you could share with us, but it's very well covered in your videos and on your website. So before I let you go, can you direct our listeners to where they can learn more and get in touch with you?
Absolutely. You can find me at the tinygiantlife.biz. There's links to most everything there. We do workshops. We sell a online video course if you need a little extra something. Of course, we have a YouTube channel, the Tiny Giant Lifestyle, and it's intended to be more about lifestyle design than Aircrete specifically, but Aircrete seems to be gaining quite a bit of interest. And there's all the information about pretty much anything you would need to know for free in there. You just kind of have to dig through the videos and you'll find it. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing such a well thought out perspective from experiences of both industrial and natural building. I hope that we can catch up again, and I'd love to hear more as things develop and new design ideas come through. And this has been really cool. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, I thank you for having me, and you have yourself a great evening.
Yeah, you too. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Daniel, that was great, man. Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad you had me on. I know it's a little reserved from natural building, and honestly, I still have the battle sometimes between completely natural and then,
Well, I think we from both sides made a good point on how there is no such thing as a fully natural building anymore. You can't live in the modern world without the amenities of industrial construction, but also giving a good idea from your perspective. Like, I love that you have worked in natural building before, because a lot of the Aircrete people that I've seen out there, like, that's just all they do, and they don't have a whole lot of reference for other ways of building, and are kind of caught up in somewhat of the fad of it.
Right.
But I really appreciate, that you have this perspective from both sides, and more than anything, that you've really thought through the building design components and the lifestyles that go with them being kind of the more important part. And Aircrete can be kind of a way of facilitating that transition to a healthier lifestyle, but there are also other ways of doing that too.
Right. At the very least, at least you have a house that's not off-gassing a lot of different chemicals that can cause
For
problems.
sure. For sure.
But the convenience factor is nice. And, I never really planned on doing this or trying to start up any kind of business in it, but there seems to be a great demand. And
Yeah, there does.
I don't want to demonstrate anything that I don't have built and ready to see. But
course.
soon we'll be going with a wattle and daub double-walled house. That's hopefully almost completely passive. And
Very cool.
yeah, use some night sky radiant cooling. Of course, that's only works.
What's your insulation in between that?
We're going to use just weeds, actually.
Really?
The hollow stemmed weeds. They hold air inside of them.
How do they hold up to mold and bug resistance?
Well, we're going to first soak everything in boric acid, and
Sure.
then dry it out, and then use it for infill. And I'll probably again again, I can't make it completely natural and get it insulating, in that I need a vapor barrier at the bottom, because we are in a pretty humid climate. So, but anyway, the point being that eventually I'll be able to demonstrate that, and I don't like showing people things that haven't been demonstrated. And but yeah, I'm definitely moving there. But then sheet metal roof, it's manufactured product, but at the same time, I don't have to go cut another cedar tree every 3 to 5 years and make a new slices.
And you can collect rainwater off the top without having to worry about the preservatives in the wood contaminating your rainwater.
Exactly. So
that was the thing about cedar that really bummed me out. I was like, yeah, this is so cool. Oh, it kind of poisons your drinking water if you're trying to collect rainwater from the roof.
Right.
Damn.
So yeah, it's always that struggle.
There's compromises and there's upsides to everything. It's always a struggle to kind of balance them out and fit that in with the context and the place and everything. It makes it for so much more work than it's easy to charge clients for. Like, I don't even do contracting anymore. I just do design and consulting for exactly that reason. I just couldn't make it pay when it comes, like, if I was going to do everything as responsibly and well thought out as I always wanted to, I just couldn't make it affordable for the clients who were coming for exactly that type of lifestyle. Yeah. So I got more into the education side. I was like, look, if you really want to build this within your budget, you're going to have to learn how to do a lot of it yourself.
Yeah, I've had quite a few people asking me to build their houses, but it is a real struggle. I mean, because in our society, we value convenience and affordability, and affordability in our case often means the ability to finance it at a bank and just pay it out.
Right.
And so that becomes very difficult with natural building. And then if you're going to source everything ethically, that becomes a problem, because really at its root is the society itself has got some issues at its root,
Yeah. And it's tricky because, in a lot of the cases, like, unless you're doing it yourself, you're basically trying to get someone else to build a sustainable or a resilient or regenerative lifestyle for you. And you still maintain a disconnect from the process, from the natural systems that support you, which, I mean, everyone's got to go through their own transition and their own choices themselves, but it should cost more to outsource it to somebody else, to pay someone to do a good job for you, And, a lot of people who are working in, IT or any of these other trades that pay so much more, fine, that's great. You'll be able to pay other people with other skill sets to do that. But if you're trying to make it on, a working person's budget and pay somebody else to do it, you're cutting corners. Like you've just
Yeah.
got to at some point bite down and realize that you have to take more responsibility for the processes of your life if you want to actually live that way.
You're right. It's kind of like saying, I'm going to go buy a smart car and I'm going to save the world or save the whales because I'm
Right.
burning half as much gas. It doesn't
Right.
solve the root problem.
Right. At some point, you're going to have to reconnect with the sources of sustenance in your life. Yeah. It's tricky. It's really tricky.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that there are so many more voices advocating for this. So these days, I never struggle to find people for the podcast. There's a much bigger interest and industries propping up around the stuff that I thought I was kind of on the fringe of a couple of years ago when I was starting. But even by then, it had already taken hold pretty well. So that's at least encouraging.
Oh, it is. And to see that industry and that awareness and that willingness to live differently, it's really starting to show up now. And that
Yeah.
encourages me. There's a lot of people they need to make that transition, and that's where Aircrete kind of comes in for the people I'm talking to, is that literally they can go buy themselves a little lake lot on the edge of town, and in 2 weeks, they're in something. And that rent money can then go into whatever they want to improve.
That's really what it comes down to. Like if you fully embrace the lifestyle of taking responsibility for every part of your consumption, but also your contributions, I never advocate for anybody to go fully self-sustaining because it's entirely inefficient if you're doing it by yourself or with a small family. It still needs to be integrated with a part of a community and a larger understanding of, the systems that we interact with. But if you're willing to make it a lifestyle, like you really can still get away from most of the traps of, consumerism and wasteful living if you're willing to change how you live.
Well, I was an IT manager for 5 years.
No kidding.
And then Exxon bought out the company that my company worked for. And without notice, I was laid off along with about 2/3 of the workforce from that company.
Wow.
And, I'd been studying a lot of this and it was a great opportunity. So I cashed out what little bit of retirement money I had from that job. And I actually did live off the land for about a year and a half. And I was able to produce or forage all of my own food. And I didn't produce any trash. There was no need to pay trash service and have it thrown in somebody else's backyard. But it was an amazing lifestyle that honestly, it does require a lot of change. And a lot of people have a hard time making that mental leap. But man, it was a good life. But as I learned, you can survive and produce everything. But then as I got to talking to old timers in the area, they had nice little community things. Like they still had an old community get together where like at the end of the crop season, everybody would just kind of get together. It used to be at the town square, but now it's shrunk down to about 5 people to get together at a little community building. But basically, if you're growing apricots and you have an abundance, then you just bring everything up there and everybody's free to pick up what they need. Trying to
Swap
do
and trade.
Yeah. But trying to do everything yourself is difficult. And community, I mean, obviously, music being a great example. I love music, but I'm just not terribly inclined to play an instrument.
Yeah. See, that's what I mean too. Like, I think it is realistic for someone with the means to get started kind of running, like with some land of their own, to produce all their own food. But when you talk about your own entertainment, your own fibers, your own clothing, your own tools, your own electricity, like that's where it's like, nah, don't do that. Like hook up with a community. Someone's going to be better and at any of those things to produce enough of a surplus that you can focus on the things that you're better at, and you can trade those surpluses in within each other. And that's how our species has survived over time. It's not by going off in little family units trying to do it all ourselves.
Right. And I think we're designed to function that way. I mean, really,
Oh,
because,
absolutely.
just the interaction you get with other people when you're doing this is what's great. And obviously, me personally, I would hate to sit there and knit something together. That would just drive me crazy. But there's other people who they love it. It's their thing. And so, we all complement one another as a species.
Absolutely. Yeah. And people, make those little tasks their own, like knitting was not usually something that people did in isolation. Like older women in the community would get together and socialize and talk about their lives and stuff. And while they were knitting and trade patterns and techniques and whatever. A lot of these things came out of the socialized versions of them that helped it to spread, helped it to train other people, but also fostered connection and community more than the actual production of a thing itself.
Oh, absolutely. Because
And that's what I've gotten really interested in a lot lately. Like I've done a series on the podcast in the past. I'm not sure if you've heard it, like on community building and what it means to create healthy communities. And it's an aspect of an interview that I'm publishing actually this Friday with Mark Lakeman, who's an architect who's worked a lot on designing communities that are healthy, that have communal congregation spaces, and undoing sort of the violence and the disconnect from colonial infrastructure. And that kind of stuff really, really inspires me, especially too now that I've moved to Europe, where the communities are configured differently, right?
Right.
A lot of them, except for some of the newer developments, were all made before car infrastructure could transport you to a supermarket real quick. And so you can walk around all of these communities with no problem, right?
Right.
And just feeling how that's different in the way that you go about your daily tasks has been interesting to observe. And it's just something that I've picked up as I've lived around different parts of the world, and definitely makes you think about that when you get into design projects of your own.
Oh, absolutely. I would love, in fact, I kind of want to put together my own, not my own, but, a community eventually, but I'm not there yet. I went to Argentina, and they had kicked out the international bankers, the not Federal Reserve, the IMF, International Monetary Fund. They kicked them all out, so they packed up all their currency, left the country, and they were barely able to get by. And then they had 100% tariff on anything imported. So it really kept the industrial system out of there for a while. And it was really neat to stay in a community for a period of time where, it wasn't like you went to the grocery store who had a product made by a company that just doesn't care. It's about, profit for the company. And then you're going to a checkout lady who doesn't care or know anything about a product, and just, might even give you an attitude for having to do her job.
Right.
Whereas there, literally, if you wanted fruit, you went to the fruit guy as you walk down the street.
The guy who grew it.
Exactly. The guy who grew the fruit, who picked it that morning and brought it in, him and his family, or maybe some hired help, depending on the size of it. And then if you wanted vegetables, you went down the street to the vegetable guy.
Yeah.
If you're a meat eater, you went to the meat market where they literally just brought the cow in. And it really was, it was very
When you have a conversation with that person, right? And you understand what their life is like, what their routines are, how those animals or how those products were raised or taken care of, and how that, it's a much more connected way of operating within a community.
Absolutely. I ran across, just talking. It's such a human experience. And you find out, oh, you don't have running water, and you're trying to get running water, but you don't know how to wire this stuff up. And it's like, well, okay, when do you have some time? I went over there and I hooked up some float switches and a pump. So we got water pumped up to an elevated tank. And for the first time in their life, they had running water. I mean, they were dancing in the water. And of course, I'm thinking immediately, man, look how much more water they're wasting now. But anyway, it was an interesting observation for myself.
Sure.
But then he gave me what, if you had to put a monetary value to it in garden produce, was probably substantially more than the monetary value of what I provided him. And so it's just like, how
it didn't cost him that amount of money. It would have cost him more to pay you what you would have done just through that closed transaction, right?
Exactly.
And I love exploring the possibility of those types of transactions that are not so rigid, that leave opportunities for like a friendly amount of debt, which allows people to actually go above and beyond the payments that are required. And those things build connections and relationships more than just, the closed transactions that money creates.
Right. There's this reciprocity, you do something nice for somebody just because you can. I mean, and you don't have this schedule that's unbendable. I mean, actually down there after lunch, they go into siesta until pretty much sundown.
Yeah.
So,
I'm accommodating myself to the schedule here too. Like people wake up at 10. I'm used to a farm schedule. I used to wake up at like 5, and for me, sleeping in is like 6:30 here, and then people go to bed at 1 or 2 after eating dinner at 10, and I'm like, okay, how much of this am I going to take on myself, and how much of it is just like I need to have a certain amount? Like I want to see the sunrise most days.
Wow, I didn't
And
realize
so
they still.
yeah, I'm taking naps. I'm taking on the siesta lifestyle, man. I'm all about it.
It's a kind of a nice way to live, though.
It is. I mean, especially I've had people like they're like, "Oh, I like sleeping too much. That's why I have these long nights." I'm like, "I like sleeping more than you. I do it twice a day." But yeah. Well, anyway, Daniel, I got to get on here. But it was a real pleasure talking to you. I'm really glad that you reached out through the podcast, and let's stay in touch. If you get that Waddling Dog project going, I would love to at least see pictures and learn more about what you're working on.
I will. I'll get back in touch with you whenever I got a new project that might be of interest. And right now, I've
Brilliant.
just got to finish out the year, and I've kind of got a schedule that's keeping me busier than I want to be.
Awesome.
So,
Well, that's busy. Busy is good sometimes too.
yeah. It's just about getting to the point that I can demonstrate a finished product. It's not like I can just
Nice.
create a building each and every day and then have a new presentation. So
Sure.
it's just
sure.
a matter of time. But I do appreciate you and what you're doing in your podcast. And
Thanks so much.
anybody,
Yeah, and feel free to leave feedback or let me know what you think about other things as they come out if you get a chance to listen to. I'm always happy to get someone else's opinion who knows.
absolutely, I'll do it.
All right. Well, take care, Daniel. Thanks so much for your time.
You too, Oliver.
All right. Bye.
Bye.